Hello everyone, my name is Gavin McGarrigle. I'm the Western Regional Director for Unifor, and I bring greetings on behalf of our National President Lana Payne and our Secretary Treasurer Len Poirier. We have 315,000 members across the country. We're in every major sector. We have about 20,000, 24,000 members that work in trucking, courier, logistics, school bus. We have seen, like other speakers, deregulation, which has meant fluctuations in recruitment, a race to the bottom on standards, and we've been pushing, even before it was called the Safe Rates Campaign, to establish minimum floors for rates. Because we know, as has been mentioned, that if you allow the individual companies to set rates, it's like water. It will always find the lowest point, and you will always be trying to stop the flood everywhere. And I want to talk about the Vancouver port structure. Of course, we have the dockers in Vancouver, who are represented by the International Longshore Warehouse Union of Canada. But we also have about 1,800 drivers. And the drivers are split. There's about 35 or 40% of those 1,800 that are in a formal union. We are the largest union in the container trucking sector in Vancouver. It is the largest port in Canada. And we have pushed. We had a massive strike in 2014. In fact, it was the third massive strike that we had in that area, but there wasn't a union. It was non-union owner-operators mostly who simply stopped work. And each time there would be some kind of a resolution where there would be some kind of minimum rates. But what it was missing was an enforcement mechanism. It was missing an auditing mechanism. It was missing penalties to make sure that we actually could enforce the safe rates. And so we went on strike. We had a right-wing government in British Columbia at the time. We had our 35–40% union workers who were on strike, joined by the rest of the workers, non-union workers. So the entire port of Vancouver was shut down for almost a month. And that caused billions of dollars of impact. So the first thing I would say to everyone when it comes to negotiating safe rates, and you know that well here in Korea, is that power concedes nothing without a demand. And you must find a way to force these companies into actually listening to you. And the way to do that is to stop the money coming in. And so what the ports did when we all went out on strike in 2014 is they said to all of the drivers who were licensed to the port, not with safe rates, just with access, they said, we are going to take away everybody's license, take away their livelihood to operate. I think it's similar to the system that we heard about earlier where people have to get commercial truck plates. Collectively, we said, go to hell. We said, we are not going to be threatened by the loss of our licenses, and we are going to continue to work, and the strike continued. We put together convoys of truckers, 600, 700 truckers that came down, and we said we would not back down. The right-wing government at the time then tried another tactic, and they said, fine, we are going to use the labor relations model to order the unionized truckers back to work. So that would have meant that 35–40% of us would have had to go back to work. The fines were hundreds of thousands of dollars. People could lose everything. But we said to the government at the time, and we said publicly, how are we supposed to go back to work in a safe environment if the rest of the non-union workers are still out on strike? This does not solve your problem. And so we told the government openly that we would defy the legislation, that we would not respect their order to go back to work. We would pay the fines. Our national union said that we would pay the fines, which I believe would have been about $100,000 Canadian dollars per day. We traveled over to Victoria, the capital, and we were setting up a press conference to talk about some of the attacks on workers, some of the unsafety of having half the port back at work and half of it not back at work. And at the end of the day, we were going to use workplace health and safety legislation to use our right to refuse unsafe work. But at the time, the government was being attacked by all of the employers. They were being attacked by everyone who simply wanted the economy to get moving again, because as I said, the impact by then was in the billions of dollars. And so we went to stand with the Labour Party, which was called the NDP, which was then in opposition. And as we got there, we met the government legislators, Minister of Transport, Minister of Labour. And they said, do you want to go do the press conference with the Labour Party about refusal and safety, or do you want to come and meet the Premier and see if we can negotiate a resolution? And so we said, we'll take door number one, we'll go meet the Premier, and we'll try and bargain an agreement. We bargained an agreement that led to the ending of the hostilities, an immediate 12% increase to the previous legislated rates, but again, there was still no enforcement mechanism. We bargained a joint action plan which said that they would have to bring in a new law to guarantee safe rates. And so as we move forward after 2014 into 2015, that right-wing government brought in what was known as the Container Trucking Act. The Container Trucking Act set minimum standards for different categories of drivers. Probably 70–80% of those 1,800 drivers at the time were owner-operators, owner-drivers. Some of them, the rest, were known as hourly drivers, where the company owned the vehicle and they were just salaried employees. And the rates for those employees were low as well. And so we continued to push to say we needed to have this system brought in, and they brought in this law to say that trip-rated owner-operators per distance, per kilometer, per zone would be paid minimum trip rates. For hourly drivers, we negotiated a minimum wage rate. The minimum wage rate in British Columbia at the time was about $14 an hour. The Minister of Labour said to me, why would I bring in another minimum wage rate when I already have one here? And I said, because your port is shut down and you need to make sure that we have a wage rate. And that wage rate at the time we brought in was about $25 an hour. So $10 or $11 an hour higher than the rates. That rate today is, I believe, over $30 an hour, and these trip rates are still in effect. There was a third category that was brought in, which was an hourly rate for owner-operator drivers. Very few actually choose to work on that rate, so it's mostly trip rates and hourly rates that are there. Now, this was a good start, but this was still a right-wing government. And I think you've experienced, the comrades here in Korea have experienced, that you can get a system put in, but if it's not permanent, if it's not enforced, if it doesn't have real teeth, then it means nothing. So this Container Trucking Act created a position known as the Container Trucking Commissioner, someone that would be appointed to oversee the audits, the enforcements, the fines. But what did they do? They got the fox to guard the henhouse. They picked the chief negotiator for the employers' consortium who bargained with the dockers. So all of the beneficial owners, the container trucking, the cargo operators, the ship owners, all of them, their chosen representative was picked as the first Container Trucking Commissioner. And one of the things that was in our joint action plan, in addition to the 12% increase, was retroactive pay, back pay for drivers. One of the first things this commissioner did is immediately said, I'm not going to enforce any back pay for drivers, and we're going to negotiate something else. So then we had to go to court. We went to court for bias. We said this is absolutely impossible. We attacked him through court, and we were able to get him removed before actually the court date came down, and we got new container truck commissioners in. Since then, we've had about 2 or 3 different container truck commissioners who must sit down with us, with the non-union sector, and they must talk to us about adjustments to those trip rates, adjustments to the hourly rates. But in addition to trip rates and hourly rates, we also negotiated as part of that package guaranteed fuel surcharge rates for all of the drivers based on a formula. We negotiated that the port would have to pay to the trucking companies, which would have to be paid to our members, waiting times at the port. Because you would have these trip rates, but if you were sitting waiting at the port for 2 and 3 hours because the port didn't care about the time of the drivers, now there are millions of dollars in penalties that get paid out on a regular basis, which is helping the port to actually be more efficient. And so we didn't give up there. We got our back pay. We continued to push, and we continued to push to change the government. And so in 2017, as we were getting this system up and running, similar to the 3-year system that you have here, many of the companies refused to pay. Many of them hid their books. Many of them avoided the fines. When the first fines started to come down, they went to court to try to challenge the legality of the entire system. But we didn't give up, and we were able to achieve a new government in 2017, a minority government, the Labour Party. It's called the New Democratic Party. We brought them into power as a major component in 2017, and in 2020 we moved that up to a majority government. And I just want to give you some statistics of the fines that have been recovered and the stolen wages that have been recovered since 2015. We have seen over $4.6 million in wages returned by order of the Commissioner back to thousands of owner-operators and hourly employees. We have seen over $1.35 million in fines to these owners that don't pay the rates on time. But we're continuing to push to tighten the screw, and we would always say some of the things that they would do were so bad that they should lose their license entirely. We said until some company gets pulled right out of the port, they're not going to be able they're going to think they can get away with it. And so finally, in the last few years, we have seen some trucking companies get their license completely canceled, and they're kicked right out of the port system and they can't go anywhere. In addition to all of this, in regular briefings that we had with the Container Truck Commissioner, we have managed to keep a cap in place on the number of total drivers in the port. Because as you know, if we start with 1,800 drivers and you don't have a cap, they will bring in 3,000 drivers who are all competing for money. And then the rates will go down and the system will fall apart. So now the system is that they all get audited on how often they actually keep the truck drivers employed. So if they have, for instance, 50 truck drivers, and when they look at the statistics, they're only keeping 35 truck drivers regularly employed, the commissioner will go in and take back their licenses and give them to another company. So they actually cannot get away with simply having bloated workforces, which forces people to compete against each other. So it's been a tremendous ride. I've spent a little bit more time on that. I'm happy to talk with any of you about that. Of course, like everything in the labor movement, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But from talking with Wolfsan, and I've been talking to her for years about this, she tells me this system that we've put into place is fairly unique around the world, and we're continuing to push it. We have campaigns that we have run in conjunction actually with the ITF on access to bathrooms. We particularly saw that very bad during COVID, when places that drivers would go into bathrooms, they weren't allowed to go in. We've seen violence. We have issues with logistics. DHL, as an example, is always trying to reduce the rates. And we also have issues with surveillance. That is also, we need some regulation around surveillance. And of course, the transition to electric vehicles and all of the things involved in that is something that keeps us awake at night as well. Tomorrow in Canada, workers across the country will be out supporting the ITF Safe Rates campaign. We are focused on organizing new members. We are focused on organizing places that need to be organized, like Amazon. In British Columbia, we are focusing not just on the warehouse drivers, warehouse workers, but also the drivers that support that final mile, and making sure that we set some basic rates for them as well. The struggle always continues, and I understand the word struggle is very important in Korea, so forgive me if I get this wrong, but I will close my remarks by saying Tujeng. Thank you very much.